This guy, Flash Thompson, he probably deserved what happened. But just because you can beat him up doesn't give you the right to. Remember, with great power comes great responsibility.
Welcome back to Thinking Critical. This is Wes, and we like to talk about all things comic books. Thought we'd talk a little bit about comic book history here today. And I do have a good friend of mine that's been reading comics for a very long time. And I posed to him, I said, what is the greatest era in Marvel Comics history? Now, I assumed, because he speaks highly of it, he was going to go and throw me a curveball and say 2005 to 2010. He didn't go there, although he does love it. I definitely assumed that he would go with the chalk, that he would say 1980 to 1985. You're talking four of the greatest runs in the history of comic books. We're talking Uncanny X-Men by Claremont. We're talking John Byrne on Fantastic Four, Frank Miller's Daredevil, Walt Simonson's Thor. Also, there's an amazing Iron Man run in there as well. Under the watchful eye of Jim Shooter. But no, Eric Breed threw me for an even bigger curveball. He went even more old school than 1980. He went all the way back to the beginning. Now, here to talk with me about that is the man so cool, they call him the Breen, the comic book hoarder himself, going off the grid, throwing me for a loop. How you doing, Eric?
I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm doing excellent, man. So you decided to go to the time when they transitioned into being Marvel Comics, 1961 to 1966. Very interesting choice, my friend. Might I say a bold choice, because at this point, in 1961, they were really only producing like 6 comic books, and they were like Western comics and anthologies. It was tales of suspense, tales to astonish, amazing adult fantasy. Obviously, it became amazing fantasy, strange tales, things like that, in a lot of Western comics. Although you see them transition into the Marvel comics that we know today by 1966, the publication output increases dramatically. We also see the introduction of the Fantastic Four, Incredible Hulk. We also, in Amazing Fantasy 15, we see the introduction of Spider-Man, which becomes Amazing Spider-Man, its own solo title. We get some classic Spider-Man tales in the early days, How Green Was My Goblin, Spidey Saves the Day, and more. Also, Journey into Mystery. In that time period, by 1966, becomes Thor. We also get the introduction of the Avengers and X-Men, I believe in the same exact month. How insane is that? As well as Daredevil. So absolutely an enormous transition period under the stewardship, I believe, of Stan Lee for the most part, for the Marvel Comics that we kind of know today.
Yeah, so if you go back to 1961, Stan had one foot out the door in his mind. Yeah, he was asked by his uncle Martin Goodman to create a team of superheroes, and we all know the story. He created the Fantastic Four,
and this was in response to the Justice League. We need to have our version of the Justice League.
Yeah, that's how the story goes. And what Stan did differently was he didn't do 4 Greek god-looking heroes. He made them regular people.
Well, he made it a family book rather than a team-up book.
Yeah. And what separated that from, say, the Justice League was this was a family that you had Reed, Sue, Johnny, and Ben. They didn't always get along. Ben was transformed into a misshapen monster who in the early days was very bitter about it. And he had feelings for Sue, and he wasn't shy about it. And so it took a while for the team to come together. But while that was going on,
no, hold on, Eric. We have to address the elephant in the room. We've done a couple of videos on this. People are going to want to say, wasn't it really Jack Kirby that created the Fantastic Four? As far as I'm concerned, it was a collaboration. They were co-created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby.
Yeah, I'm of the belief that one could not have happened without the other. I think Stan and Jack were the perfect partnership for this time, and the things that they created, you can argue back and forth as to who had more to do it than the other, but without Stan's dialogue, Jack's pictures don't come to life, and vice versa. So I'm sure they collaborated on plots. Jack might have done more of the meat and potatoes work, but they said it was Stan's dialogue. It was a perfect combination, as I said. Now, getting back to the Fantastic Four, by as early as the 4th issue, they brought back one of the Golden Age characters in the Submariner. One issue after that, they introduced Doctor Doom, the most enduring Marvel villain to date. They introduced, the Puppet Master. They brought in Alicia, who became a love interest for Ben. And as the series progressed, the team started coming together more of a family. Ben lightened up because they realized the fans really liked him. So they softened him. And, a few months after the Fantastic Four, they introduced the Hulk. They wanted a Jekyll and Hyde type character. So they, gave him a 6-issue. He had a 6-issue series. Didn't.
Was he green yet?
He was gray in the first issue, and I think that was just a printing error. So, and they said it didn't look right, so they made him green. I'm not 100% sure how that evolved, but it ended up becoming a story point they could use years later. Then we got later in 1962, we got Amazing Fantasy 15, which introduced us to Spider-Man. And then we got Thor right after that. I think we're within a month of each other. But as far as the Amazing Spider-Man, within 1 year that the character had been around, by the first annual, the storyline was the revenge of the Sinister Six. And he had a rogues gallery deep enough already, because that particular rogues gallery, Dr. Octopus introduced in issue 3, Electro introduced in issue 2, I believe. No, I'm sorry, issue 8. I think I'm not 100% sure. Craven, the Vulture, Sandman, and Mysterio. And that's not to mention he wasn't part of the Sinister Six, but they'd already introduced the Green Goblin and the Lizard. So 8 villains that are still used to this day, all created within the first 16 issues. Then you had
quite the collaboration from Stan Lee and Steve Ditko.
Yeah. And later in 1963, like as you mentioned, in 1 month, they premiered the Avengers and the X-Men. And the Avengers was more of that team that Martin Goodman was probably looking for, because it featured Thor, who was in his own, it was in Journey into Mystery. You had Iron Man, who had just premiered in Tales of Suspense. You had Ant-Man and the Wasp, who'd been introduced in Tales to Astonish, and the Hulk. Well, what separated, again, this from your typical DC, like Justice League, was the Hulk left the book after just 1 issue because he felt the team didn't respect him, and which they didn't. And then he teamed up with Namor to become the villains of the very next issue. And then, and I know this was, I've always wondered if this was by design. Issue 4, they bring back another Golden Age classic hero in Captain America, in one of the best known stories of all time, where they find him encased in ice, and where where Submariner had come across some Eskimos worshiping an ice god, turned out to be Captain America. So he threw him in the water, where the Avengers just happened to be in their sub, returning from wherever it was that they were. So we have those 2 characters back. Then we get the Daredevil in early 1964. And all of these characters, they developed, rogues gallery villains for them. These books, like Daredevil, had a supporting cast of a best friend, a secretary, Karen, and they had, and again, unlike DC books that just told a story and then forgot about, all these books had continuing stories and continuing plot lines. So you kind of had, if you missed an issue, you actually missed something, which was another difference between Marvel and DC at that time. And I'm going to go into a couple of the classic stories from that era, but I also want to mention, and this was probably as a result of the James Bond movie franchise becoming pretty successful. Marvel took another character they had in Sergeant Fury, and took him from, they updated him, gave him an eye patch, and made him the head of S.H.I.E.L.D. And that was another team dynamic that really worked well. That they a couple of the characters from the Howling Commandos had become members of S.H.I.E.L.D. You had Dum Dum Dugan and I believe Gabe Jones. And so creatively, those first handful of years, it was just amazing what they were able to come up with. Now, a couple of the storylines that are memorable from that era, obviously, the first thing people think of is the Galactus trilogy, which actually was only 2 issues because in the first half of issue 48, they were wrapping up the Inhumans storyline. In the second half of issue 50 was Johnny going off to Metro College. So that incredible storyline basically was confined to what amounted to 2 issues. But that was also at a point in one year stretch, Stan and Jack came up with the rest of the Inhumans because they'd already introduced Medusa. There was the introduction of Galactus, the Silver Surfer, and then 2 issues after that, the introduction of the Black Panther. And if that wasn't enough, in between issues 50 and 52, there was what many people consider the greatest single issue in Marvel Comics history, This Man, This Monster, where the Thing shows up on a guy's doorstep, feeling sorry for himself and coming out of the rain. And the guy happens to be someone who hates Reed Richards because he believes that Reed is only in it for the glory. So he has a machine that basically switches places with Ben, where he gets Ben's powers and Ben becomes human again. So he goes back to the Baxter Building to impersonate Ben, and Ben takes advantage of his newfound humanity to go visit Alicia because he's feeling doubts because he feels Alicia has a thing for the Surfer. So Reed is doing work in the with the Negative Zone, and he asks Ben to keep him tethered while he goes to do something in the Negative Zone, and he realizes this is his chance to do away with Reed. But then he realizes how selfless Reed really is, so he goes out in the Negative Zone, throws Reed back, and basically sacrifices himself. So in the end, he does the right thing and he dies a hero. And while that's going on, Ben's about to knock on Alicia's door, and he turns back into the Thing, and he runs away from her apartment. And that's, I said, to a lot of people, that is the single greatest issue in Marvel Comics. So that year alone of creativity is just astounding. Now, getting back, go ahead. No, to say another story I wanted to bring up was the final chapter in Amazing Spider-Man, issue 33, where half of that issue is literally Spider-Man with all this building has collapsed on him. He's got a serum that can save his aunt's life, and he basically has to summon the will to push that weight off him. And it's the weight of the world on his shoulders, brought to life, which he's able to do and get the medicine to his aunt in time to save her.
Many people believe the greatest panel in comic book history.
Yes. That's, I said, that's still talked about to this day. So there's just so much creativity in those 5 years, and so much of what they put in place that are used to this day. That's why I went with that era.
And it's crazy. It's done by so few people. When you start realizing the things that come out of that era, and the men that are at the core of it, obviously Jack and Stan Lee being the most prominent. But it's not a whole lot of men, but they're doing the amount of creativity comes out. You'd think they would have had 40 people in their office.
It seemed like it. Now, there were some contributions. Bill Everett helped out in the early Daredevils, and then Wally Wood. His brother Larry did some writing for him, and there were a couple of the Dick Ayers was around in those days, but Roy Thomas did come aboard in 1965. But those first 3 or 4 years, basically Stan, Jack, and Steve, who also co-created Doctor Strange, and Doctor Strange's Dormammu, Baron Mordo, Nightmare. I mean, just the creativity that went into that world was just, like I said, it's you wonder, it's easy to look at that stuff now and build on that, but to have the creativity to come up with that stuff, from thin air. That's what I said. Regardless of who did more, no one's ever had a more creative streak than Stan and Jack in those 5 years. With props to Steve Ditko as well.
Also, in introducing the first black superhero at that time was a pretty bold move on their part. Quite a progressive maneuver on their part, and certainly it's a character who's prominent today and still very important to the Marvel Comics universe.
And that was important to both Stan and Jack, because one thing that Marvel did very early on, if you look in the background of panels in books like The Amazing Spider-Man, Daredevil, you will see black policemen. They go to a hospital. One of the doctors would be black. They wanted that, basically from the beginning. That one of the Howling Commandos was black, and when they sent it to the colors, it was changed because they thought it was a mistake. So they've all Marvel was as progressive as the times would allow them to be, and they pushed the envelope, very early on.
And this is kind of when we start to have some seeds of discontent between Jack and Stan, which ultimately would lead to I think Jack leaving Marvel again, I believe in 1971.
1970.
Okay, 1970.
He left to go to DC.
Over some. Who gets all the credit? But it's too bad that they should have been co-billed the whole time on the Fantastic Four and some other creations. But I think in hindsight, thinking about what they built, they essentially at this point they built the foundation of what Marvel Comics is today. They transitioned it, or at least started transitioning it from a mostly pulpy kind of Western comic book line with some anthologies with things here and there, into a full-fledged shared comic book universe. They reintroduced some of the early characters, like you said, Captain America, Namor, and really at that point they're off to the races. They've essentially set the foundation for Marvel Comics, the MCU, and all the things that we see in pop entertainment today.
Yeah, so if you go back and look at those 5 years, just the incredible amount of characters that were created in that time, it's
in such limited output too. Like I said, the first year they could only put out 6 comics total. I think by 1963 they were up to 8, and by 1966 it was probably more like 14 or 16. But that's some pretty limited real estate to put that many new characters, that many new ideas that stuck and are still with us today.
Yeah, you could argue the greatest feat of creativity that Stan and Jack accomplished was being able to work around those parameters, because for people that don't know, their distribution deal was through National, who owned DC. So they weren't in any hurry to let them increase their output because they had started to become competition. So the way they were able to get all that out there with, like I said, 8, only being able to publish 6, then 8 titles a month, which they got around by at one point doing 16 bi-monthly titles. And then eventually they increased the output. And then, by the late 60s, when that deal was changed, they just opened the floodgates. But said that was a couple years after the window we're talking about.
So certainly an amazing time. Can you imagine being in the Marvel Comics offices and just seeing the creativity and realizing, I don't imagine the men in there at that point realized what they were creating, that, they were essentially creating a multi-billion dollar, franchise of entertainment that was going to last for, the next 50 years. Absolutely insanity. I'm shocked you didn't pick 1980 to 1985, just thinking about the creators in there, their creativity, some of the greatest comic book runs in the history of comic books. But it's hard to argue with 1961 and 1966 when you think about what was accomplished in very limited real estate, and the things that were created, and they essentially laid the foundation for superhero comics and superhero shared universes moving forward.
Yeah, so a lot of times when I'm asked questions like this, I discount Stan and Jack just because that's the obvious choice. So I said, when someone said, "What's the greatest run of, say, Fantastic Four?" Yeah, I'll say, okay, if I don't count Stan and Jack and then go with the rest of them, because that's the easy answer. But this time I wanted to give those first 5 years some attention. because I said without them, none of the runs, none of those eras would have been possible. And so I said, it was hard not to choose 80 to 85 for the reasons you mentioned. And I said we could go into greater depth, and someday we will. But I said those first 5 years, I wasn't around for them. I know, surprising. But it's like I said, it deserves its place in the sun because it was just a time of incredible creativity. And another thing they did in those days was that Stan set up an atmosphere, and it turned out it was mostly an illusion of the Marvel bullpen, where the fans thought that they were all these people just in one room coming up with all this great stuff. And the reality was Jack worked from home, and the Marvel bullpen more often than not was Stan and Flo. But but the people didn't care. As far as they were concerned, they were part of this, really cool little world that they'd created.
So Eric, as we finish this up, obviously we have a lot of viewers that maybe have some blind spots like yours truly in the golden Silver Age comics eras. If you could just pick out 2 stories, maybe 2 runs, not an omnibus. I know you're going to say, well, just get the omnibus. We're not going omnibus. Just pick a couple of stories from this area that you would say are must read if you want to say the best of what was available at Marvel Comics from 1961 to 1966. What would you say?
I would say the ones that I mentioned. I said the Galactus trilogy is must read material for anybody that really wants to get into the history of Marvel. And the final chapter that culminates in issue 33, that's about a 4-issue arc, and that'll give fans an idea of what it was like even back then, continuing stories.
And you're talking about Spider-Man at this point, correct?
Yes. Yeah, Amazing Spider-Man by 30 to 33, and just that storyline. In one issue alone, they introduced Harry and Gwen as just an afterthought, but it's doesn't detract from the action. And like I said, I would start there.
Very good. So thank you very much for joining me, Eric. I like talking about a little bit of history, and hopefully some of the viewers will be able to discover some things. And we definitely want to hear from the viewers. What do you think was the greatest era for Marvel Comics history? Obviously, we'll probably do a DC era up here coming up pretty soon, and we enjoy this very much. Eric, I'll give you the last word on this and before we head out.
I said, regardless of whether you pick mine or 80 to 85, or everybody's going to have their era, and it's all subjective. So whatever works for you.